My name is Spencer Walsh, and on today's episode of Hidden History, it's time for part 2 of our story on how the United States destroyed Guatemalan democracy. On last week's episode, we talked about Jacobo Arbenz, the young, democratically elected leader of Guatemala who is promising revolutionary land reform for the first time in decades, kicking out U.S. companies and very powerful landowners of the Guatemalan elite. Well, they, when we left off, teamed up to fight Jacobo Arbenz's government and his land reform policies in the form of General Castillo Armas and a small army massing just to the south of the El Salvador border. On this episode, we will talk about how Jacobo Arbenz handled some of this, how his government responded, and how the chain of information led to his eventual overthrow and a devastating 40 years of oppression backed by the United States and United States forces in the country of Guatemala for quite a long time. We pick up the story as the Castillo Armas army amasses kind of in the southern on the southern border with El Salvador, and Guatemala seeks support in the Organization of American States. We pick up with the vote on an anti-communist resolution condemning the Guatemalan government put forth by the United States in an Organization of American States meeting. And Guatemalan Foreign Minister Guillermo Torreo argued pretty strongly against this resolution brought in by the United States, as the various Latin American governments sought economic aid from the United States. So they were pretty essentially all said, we really hate Guatemala. Isn't Guatemala the worst? They're becoming communist. We would never do that. Please, United States, give us aid, right? So despite the support among delegates for Torreo's views, the anti-communist resolution passed only with Guatemala voting against, because the votes of dictatorships dependent on the U.S. and literal open threat of economic pressure from John Foster Dulles. There was, though, some support for, or some disappointment in the U.S. camp, as the support had been a little bit tougher to attain than some of those in charge would have liked. The U.S. had stopped selling arms to Guatemala way back in 1951 while signing bilateral defense agreements and increasing arms shipments to neighboring Honduras and Nicaragua. Probably not a good sign if you're Jacobo Arbenz, who, you have a relationship with the United States. Your country does for quite a long time, and they sell you arms, and all of a sudden they say, you know what, we're going to stop selling arms to you, but sell as many arms as possible to your neighbors. Maybe not a problem. And again, this is kind of an interesting situation where, over time we would see a lot of these countries. This is kind of really relatively young, kind of a Cold War period, early Cold War period, where we just did not have a lot of the same dynamics in place. And we didn't have so many kind of prior examples of what happens when coups are attempted in the third world against these kind of Western imperialist powers. And it really would have been, could it have been more beneficial, as we saw in kind of Cuba do later in the decade and into the 60s, to go for Soviet support? And would Soviet support have kind of helped them, or some sort of kind of external support to go against really what seemed like a behemoth of the United States at the time? If you're looking at this from the Arbenz perspective, you can kind of see all these forces slowly aligning against you. But what are you going to do about it? You're just one country surrounded by unfriendly dictatorships and people who really have much more to benefit than by just knocking you off and forgetting that your government really was to ever exist. So the U.S. promised Guatemalan military, though, they could to obtain arms if Arbenz was deposed. Something that, give the military promises of weapons, they will probably be on your side pretty quickly. By Arbenz, by 1954, Arbenz had become pretty desperate for weapons. And again, similar to Cuba, similar to a lot of other states, just because not necessarily of some strong ideological connection, but because there was no other established force that could compete with the kind of actions, the kind of all-encompassing, crushing actions of America at the time. They really moved towards Czechoslovakia, which would have been the first time a Soviet bloc country shipped weapons to the Americas, an action seen as really establishing a communist beachhead in the Americans. The weapons were delivered to Guatemala through Puerto Barrios, the port once owned by the UFC. They were shipped by the Swedish freight company MS Alfhelm, which sailed from Poland. The U.S. failed to intercept the shipment despite imposing an illegal naval quarantine on Guatemala at the time. However, Guatemalan army officers, quoted in the New York Times, said some of the arms were duds, worn out, or entirely wrong for use there. CIA portrayed these shipments of the Soviet weapons as interference in the United States' backyard, and it was the final spur for the CIA to launch its coup. Some of this rhetoric from the United States had a pretty strong effect on the Guatemalan military as well, kind of giving a group of people that was already pretty anti-communist the just examples in the fire that it needed to really say, and just the mental structure, the mental imagination to say, this problem with your country is way worse than you even thought it was, and something needs to be done about this now. In order to win, however, they knew they could, because they only had 480 guys, they knew that they really would not be able to, the Castillo Armas army, they would not be able to do it on their own. They would need, even if they had United States aircraft, they would need some psychological support. So this kind of came in the form of the Voice of Liberation radio station, as well as other kind of propaganda sources, presenting this victory as something that's just bound to happen. No point in resisting. Just forget about it and accept your new U.S.-backed overlords, essentially. There was a kind of trick that they did, but they were like, oh, we're deep in the Guatemalan hinterland. We've been forced from the jungles. We're in exile. But really, of course, these were relatively wealthy exiles in Miami, kind of broadcasting this and sending it back through to really just, kind of sending it back through towards the government. And they transmitted 2 hour bulletins twice a day. It was originally only intermittently heard in Guatemala, but they increased their transmitting power, allowing clear reception of the Guatemalan capital. They really have been given quite a lot of credit to historians by historians for the success of the coup, owing to the unrest they created throughout the country. They were unexpectedly assisted by the outage of government-run radio stations, which stopped transmitting for 3 weeks while a new antenna was being filled. Meanwhile, of course, though, you got all this propaganda, all this BS pouring in from the Guatemalan exiles in the United States. It was time for the invasion. Castillo Armas' forces of 480 men split into 4 teams, ranging in size from 60 to 198. On 15th of June, 1954, these 4 forces left their bases in Honduras and El Salvador and assembled in various towns just outside the Guatemalan border. The largest force was supposed to attack the Atlantic Harbor in Puerto Barrios, while they had some other people go through the smaller towns, kind of around the Guatemalan Army's largest frontier post, of course, in the southern borders of El Salvador. Meanwhile, Castillo's Armas planes flew over a pro-government rally in the capital, really making things seem quite apparent and quite dangerous. At 8:20 a.m. on the 18th of June, 1954, Castillo Armas led his invading troops over the border. The coup had begun. The U.S. Psychological Strategy Board ordered a bombing of Matamoros Fortress in downtown Guatemala City, and a U.S. P-47 warplane flown by a mercenary pilot bombed the city of Chiquimula. Castillo Armas demanded Arbenz's immediate surrender. The invasion provoked a brief panic in the capital, which quickly decreased as the rebels failed to make any striking moves. Bogged down by supplies and lack of transportation, Castillo Armas took several days to reach his targets, although their planes blew up a bridge on the 19th of June. But when the rebels did reach their targets, they were met with further setbacks. A force of 122 men charging into Zacapa, which is a kind of a southern Guatemalan city, were either intercepted or decisively beaten by just 30 Guatemalan soldiers, with only 30 men escaping death or capture. The raid at the main Atlantic port city failed as well, and it was pretty clear that this coup wasn't going quite as planned. Early in the morning on 27th of June 1954, the CIA Lockheed P-38M Lightning attacked Porto San Jose and dropped napalm bombs on a British cargo ship, SSS Springford, which was on charter to the U.S. company W.R. Grace & Company line after being loaded with Guatemalan coffee and cotton. The CIA had to pay $1 million U.S. dollars specifically in compensation. Then at the time, they bombed Honduran towns all around the south, and the rebel forces had begun. With a handful of bombers, the rebel forces begun with were shot down by the Guatemalan army within a few days, causing Castillo Armas to demand more from the CIA, which Eisenhower quickly agreed to provide. So, Arbenz pretty smartly said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to kind of marshal the people. This is what he tried to do, arming military-age population, workers' militias, and the Guatemalan army. But, again, he was short on weapons. But he really, unsurprisingly, received a lot of resistance from the army who, after really being kind of sweet-talked by a lot of U.S. and UFC and kind of Guatemalan exile forces, said, you know what? The civilians would not like to go into a war yet. Things are not that bad. They're kind of failing right now. The coup is kind of failing right now. Just leave it to us, and we will handle it. Selected to lead the counterattack was Carlos Enrique Diaz, the chief of the Guatemalan Armed Forces, and Diaz chose a corps of officers who were all regarded to be men of personal integrity and who were actually loyal to Arbenz. On the night of the 19th of June, most of the Guatemalan troops in the capital region left for Zacapa, one of the area's heaviest of fighting, joined by some pretty smaller detachments from the other garrisons. Arbenz stated the invasion was a farce, but worried it would be defeated on the Honduran. If it was defeated on the Honduran border, Honduras would use it as an excuse to declare war on Guatemala, which again could lead to a U.S. invasion, something that Arbenz justifiably feared. Rumors then were spread through the Voice of Liberation, the CIA propaganda radio station, that worries throughout the countryside of the fifth column attack was imminent as large numbers of peasants went to the government and asked for weapons to defend their country. They were repeatedly told that the army was successfully defending our country. Nonetheless, though, peasant volunteers assisted the government war effort, manning roadblocks and donating supplies to the army. Many historians will tell you, though, that the decision of Arbenz to just go with the military would probably be one of his worst, frankly. The Arbenz government pursued diplomatic means also to try and end the invasion, as they were really kind of clearly caught flat-footed. They went to Mexico, which refused to get involved, in El Salvador, which was already kind of on Team USA, just reported the interaction to the United States. Arbenz's largest diplomatic initiative was through the UN Security Council, but on the 18th of June, the Guatemalan foreign minister petitioned the council to take measures necessary to put a stop to this aggression. She said Nicaragua and Honduras were also responsible for. The debate was a pretty lengthy and heated situation with, of course, Nicaragua and Honduras saying any wrongdoing was false, any accusations of wrongdoing was false. And the U.S. stating that Eisenhower's role as a general in World War II demonstrated he was against imperialism, of course. The Soviet Union was the only country to support Guatemala, and when the U.S. and allies proposed referring the matter to the OAS, the Soviet Union vetoed the proposal. Pretty smart there, at least for the Soviet Union, knowing the kind of shadow, puppet nature of the OAS, because it's being completely controlled by Washington. When the U.S. accompanied this with threats to the foreign offices of both countries, the U.S. stopped supporting their other initiatives to the United States, to the UK and France. Britain and France kind of quickly fell in line, even after raising some objections and kind of going to saying, hey, maybe Guatemala should get some help on this. The United States was like, do you want support with us for anything ever again? And they were like, yeah, we kind of do. So they kind of backed off from that. The UN Secretary General at the time, Dag Hammarskjöld, this is just a rough guess at how to pronounce that one, called the U.S. position there the most serious blow aimed at the United Nations. Washington used its influence to delay the entry of the Inter-American Peace Committee, into the coup-torn country. They were trying to do a fact-finding mission until the coup was completed and military dictatorship was installed. Arbenz was initially confident, though, his army would dispatch the rebel force. Victory of a small garrison of 30 soldiers over the 180-strong rebel force of Zacapa strengthened his belief. A kind of battalion was formed to be led by Colonel Victor M. Leon, who was believed to be loyal to Arbenz. He was assured Arbenz everything would be fine. Other members of the government, though, were not so happy about this. They were pretty suspicious of Leon. Afraid of U.S. intervention in Castillo Armas's favor, he did not tell Arbenz of his suspicions, though, or some of these folks, including Army Chief of Staff Parianello, inspected the troops at Zacapa in June, and he pretty much believed the army would not fight. He did not, though, tell Arbenz of his suspicions. Some of the Communist Party leaders also kind of doubted this. Acting Secretary General sent a member of the Communist Party, Alvarado Monzon, sent a member of his committee of Zacapa to investigate. He came to the same conclusion. Arbenz was made aware of this. He sent another investigator. He too returned the same report, carrying an additional message for Arbenz from the officers of Zacapa, asking the president to resign. The officers believed that given the U.S. support for the rebels, defeat was inevitable, and Arbenz was to blame for it. He essentially said that if Arbenz did not resign, the army was likely to strike a deal with Castillo Armas and march on the capital with him. During that period, Castillo Armas had begun to intensify his aerial attacks with those extra planes Eisenhower quickly approved. They had limited material success. Many of the bombs were some of the same surplus material from World War II and failed to explode. Nonetheless, they had a pretty significant psychological impact. This all-encompassing threat of the United States being viewed as this real behemoth. Arbenz was afraid of intervention. The army was afraid of U.S. intervention, and they were kind of viewed as this unstoppable force, justifiably so. And it really demoralized, especially with no civilian support, it really demoralized the United States Army. On the night of the 25th of June, Arbenz called a meeting of senior leaders in the government, political parties, and labor unions. Colonel Diaz was present. The president told them that the army of Zacapa had abandoned the government and the civilian population needed to be armed in order to defend the country. Diaz raised no objections, and the Union pledged several thousand troops. Between them, when the troops marched the next day, only a few hundred showed up. Civilian population in the capital had fought alongside the Guatemalan Revolution twice before, during 1944 and the attempted coup of 1949, but on this occasion the army, intimidated by the U.S., refused to fight. New members were reluctant to fight both the invasion and their own military. Seeing this, Diaz reneged on his plan to support the president and began plotting to overthrow Arbenz with the assistance of other senior army officers. They informed Perifoy of this plan, asking him to stop the hostilities in return for Arbenz's resignation. Perifoy promised to arrange a truce, and the plotters went to Arbenz, informing him of their decision. Arbenz, utterly exhausted and seeking to preserve at least a measure of democratic reforms he had brought, agreed without demur. And just like that, it was really kind of incredible, just not really any kind of fighting, no dramatic storming of the Capitol. The president didn't have to flee. Essentially, it became clear that this government was too intimidated, the army too demoralized, and by just the specter of endless United States support, just like they had seen in Iran relatively recently. So they essentially, no other way of putting it, they gave up on the at 8 p.m., 27th of June, 1954, having taped a resignation speech that was broadcast an hour later. He left the presidential palace. He was stating he was resigning in order to eliminate the pretext for the invasion and that he wished to preserve the gains of the October Revolution in 1944. He walked to the nearby embassy of Mexico seeking political asylum. 2 months later, he was granted safe passage out of the country he once controlled and flew to exile in Mexico. 120 Arbenz loyalists or communists was allowed to leave, and the CIA stated none of the assassination plans contemplated by the CIA were actually implemented. So again, fact check on that one there, as a lot more communists would be disappeared, though, in the preceding years. On the 30th of June, 1954, the CIA began a comprehensive destruction process of the documents related to Operation PB Success. When an oversight committee in the Senate in 1975 investigated the history of the CIA's assassinations program and requested information about the CIA's assassination, work in Guatemala, the CIA said, "Oh, we lost it." Anyway, But journalist Annie Jacobson stated the CIA claim of no assassinations having taken place was pretty doubtful. The CIA back in 1997 had managed to recover some of the documents that it said were lost. Names of assassination targets, though, had all been redacted, making it essentially impossible to verify whether any of the people on the CIA assassination list were actually killed as part of the operation. There was a bit of kind of back and forth, rather hilariously. Diaz, the general who kind of turned last minute on Arbenz and the Arbenz government, did kind of try and convince the CIA that he would be the perfect guy to come and stay and take over the presidency. Then there was another general who tried to take control for a while, and eventually Armas Castillo reinstalled himself as president. So in September of the same year, he was formally declared president. Of course, the U.S. at this time really hyping him up. It was the coup was up pretty reviled internationally, but it was really spun by a lot of people as in the United States as this big victory, and all these kind of propaganda outlets, this big victory in the context of, again, McCarthyism at home, Cold War abroad. This is going to be a big victory against communism and a possible Soviet regime in Latin America that really could have been a big problem. Because again, they're receiving these weapons from Czechoslovakia and all that stuff. Meanwhile, though, Castillo quickly removed voting rights for illiterate Guatemalans and canceled the new agrarian reform law, which forced peasants to give up their newly acquired lands. Castillo also decreed a preventative penal law against communism, which led to the arbitrary arrest of individuals labeled as communists. The regime imprisoned thousands of people indefinitely, allowing them no right of appeal. Meanwhile, resentment began to surface of the CIA's role in toppling the alleged communist-backed government of Arbenz, and Guatemalans protested during Richard Nixon, then vice president's trip to South America in 1958. For Guatemalan people, the post-coup history, really up until this day, frankly, has been defined by one thing, and that is violence and brutal largely state-backed repression, and just, again, attacking any sort of dissenting or even groups that even look like they may be dissenting. Of a civil war with many leftist kind of backed insurgencies, which officially began in 1960, but really kind of had been brewing, in the late 50s as well. A broad polarization between rich and poor in the country, as there was just no effort at social reform, because frankly, this coup had proven that, at least in Guatemala, it seemed impossible. And the specter of U.S. influence raining down on the country just seemed to be too much. Government military forces and right-wing militias battled leftist rebels, mostly Mayan insurgents who were fighting for economic and social justice. And in the Civil War, 93% of civilian attacks were committed by the Guatemalan government, backed all throughout, not just in the coup, but all throughout by the United States. Government-backed militias acted largely as death squads, creating terror in the Guatemalan population with forced disappearances of victims, often followed by torture and murder. The mutilated bodies of victims, many of them labor leaders and political opponents, were dumped in ditches, on sidewalks, and along roads. In the next 3 decades, the U.S. continued its war against communism in Guatemala and throughout Latin America, supporting right-wing military governments that openly violated human rights. And some of those we may talk about in the weeks to come. You have to stay tuned. The 1966 election in Guatemala brought to power the Revolutionary Party and the candidate Julio Cesar Mendez Montenegro, the first civilian president since Jacobo Arbenz. During his campaign, Montenegro promised to revitalize the economy, head off inflation, and work towards social justice. Meanwhile, he had a secret agreement with the army not to interfere in its war against left-wing guerrillas. So, it was kind of a perfect kind of callback to Arevalo, this guy who was kind of there to upset the vote, but not upset it too much, kind of all while tamping down on some of the more revolutionary powers that existed, or revolutionary forces that existed in the country. Not to say that there are powers of any type. Montenegro won the majority vote in the election, but violence continued to intensify between the left and the right. Again, this is kind of just wasn't simply a left versus right. This was state-backed, much more powerful militias against indigenous Mayan people. What little trade union activists that there were, or former trade union activists that there were, and just leftist guerrillas kind of out in the forests, not really able to do too much. again, death pretty much to anyone who even collaborated or was thought to have collaborated with them in the Guatemalan countryside was soon to follow. Surprise, surprise, a liberal president who made some pretty paper concessions while really paying no attention to the raging essential civil war that was going on, kind of concurrent to government rule in the country, wasn't really long for that world. So by November 1970, another colonel, Carlos Arena Osorio, a conservative military commander, was elected president, campaigning to restore law and order. He immediately suspended all civil liberties and placed the country in a state of siege. And that siege was against the countryside. And it was not really on behalf of the left wing to kind of stop the violence that was coming from elements of the military and these government and U.S.-backed death squads. It was against the left, and it was a siege to really fully quash them. By March 1971, there had been more than 700 political killings, including labor leaders, students, and politicians. By mid-1970, the repression in rural areas intensified further, passing a bill, so much so that Jimmy Carter had to pass a bill to cut off military aid and credit to Guatemala in 1977. A year later, General Fernando Romero Lucas Garcia became president, and in what the international community labeled a fraudulent election, Garcia continued his campaign of unprecedented terror. And, love to see the U.S. here taking the moment right as, exactly what they have sowed for decades upon decades in the region comes time for reaping. They immediately cut off aid, wipe their hands and say, "Oh, we don't want any part of this. This is too far." Again, just completely ignoring all their actions for decades upon decades that led up to this situation in the first place. In 1981, addressing decades of violence and military dictatorships in Guatemala, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission released a report blaming Garcia's government for thousands of illegal executions there between 1970 and 83, became known as one of the worst for human rights in Guatemala, where at least 50,000 people died in the violence and 200,000 Guatemalans fled to neighboring countries. Hundreds of thousands or more were internally displaced because of systematic repressions and killings by the military. So now, by 82, it was time for a new general to take charge. That was Efrain Rios Montt, seizing power in a coup. This was really the kind of tail end of this time of extreme violence, this kind of quashing of all dissent by any means necessary. And again, this was not a fair-handed, attack the right-wing military death squads. No, this was support them to take out the left-wing people. Despite the confirmation of massacres in Guatemalan villages across the country by anti-guerrilla forces in 1983, a newly elected President Ronald Reagan overturned the arms embargo imposed by Carter 3 years earlier. Reagan claimed Guatemala's human rights conditions were improving and authorized the sale of military hardware, including weapons and vehicles, to the country's government. Meanwhile, a then-secret 1983 cable noted a rise in right-wing violence, an increasing number of bodies appearing in gullies and ditches. So, again, was that something to be covered up or something to be encouraged by the CIA? A sign of things working well. That is something that you can interpret for yourself. By that time, things were, of course, getting increasingly contentious, and Rios Montt's dictatorship finally lost control. This time, another general, Meja Victorias, led the revolt, which paved the way for 3 years later, the country's first civilian president in 16 years. Vinicio Cereza, a Christian Democrat, again, one of these kind of moderate people who just wants the country to function normally, won election with 70% of votes. Guatemalans and outsiders saw Cerezo as an opportunity to bring justice to the country. Instead, it was amnesty for members of the army that protected them from being prosecuted for any prior human rights violations, all water under the bridge. Meanwhile, the civilian war death toll grew from 100,000 to 100,000, and more than 40,000 civilians had been disappeared. Jorge Serrano Elias succeeded Cerezo in 1991. Under his mandate, the government attempted to prosecute human rights violators, but those efforts were thwarted after Serrano's government was weakened by accusations of corruption and appropriating state funds. He was forced to resign by 1993. The same year, Guatemala's legislature elected Ramiro de Leon Carpillo to replace him. Meanwhile, there was peace negotiations that took place by 1994, as it seemed to be a new turn. Peace talks and again between the guerrilla insurgents and the government began. In 1996, rebels declared a ceasefire. The Clinton administration suspended military training for the Guatemalan army, which again they were still doing up to the Clinton army actively training a murderous army that was encouraging civil war and destruction of not just civilians, but not just these left-wing guerrillas out there in the countryside, just by any means necessary, just complete asymmetrical war. Just any civilian that may have been associated with them was immediately disappeared, thrown into a ditch or a gully, again according to that secret CIA cable. To this day, though, most of these abuses have not been investigated, and the perpetrators have yet to have been brought to justice. In May 1997, the CIA declassified 1,400 pages of reports on its participation and orchestration of the 1954 coup. The documents show, again, this participation distributing the guns and the money to the opposition forces and facilitating training to mercenaries through almost 4 decades of the Civil War. And again, this whole, post-coup history, this refusal to take responsibility and talk about that as well is so important, because that leads to so much of the destabilization and the craziness we see in Guatemala today. In 1999, the UN-backed Commission for Historical Clarification released a report saying that Guatemalan security forces were behind, again, the 93%, that number you'll probably hear a lot about if you study this in any way, of all human rights atrocities. 93% were committed by Guatemalan security forces, which U.S. were supporting and funding all throughout, except for that small 3-year period because of Carter. Of these, the 23,671 were victims of arbitrary execution, and 83% of fully identified victims were migrants from the Quiche area. The report also recognized the role of the U.S. in its anti-communistic foreign policy and assisting Guatemala's national intelligence apparatus in the training of a counterinsurgency, key factors which had bearing on human rights violations during the armed confrontation. In March of 1999, we saw a bit of a step in the right direction, where Bill Clinton publicly apologized to Guatemalans during a short visit to the country. In July 2005, thousands of records were discovered in the Guatemalan National Police Archive, containing information of 36 years of internal armed conflict that resulted in 200,000 deaths and disappearances. A court, the Guatemalan Human Rights Ombudsman, again inspected the documents. The PDH is the name. It's Guatemalan Human Rights Ombudsman. Due to a $2 million grant from the governments of Switzerland and Sweden, of all places, they're trying to restore and organize the documents. Spanish judge Santiago Pedraz Gomez issued international arrest warrants for the 2 dictators, Montt and Maya Victores. Later in the year, Spanish government requested their extradition based on universal jurisdiction, the universal jurisdiction law for cases of genocide committed during Guatemalan Civil War. That request was obviously denied, and a lot of that impunity and immunity, frankly, for a lot of these perpetrators still remains, especially some of the worst perpetrators, still remains to this day. And when it comes down to it, through the backing of the 1954 coup and the continued funding of an almost genocidal urge to wipe out the left and anyone associated with it, whether it be Mayans, whether it be teachers, whether it be anyone, seen looking funny at a union member, like you may want to support them, those people were ruthlessly exterminated by any means necessary by the United States government and by Guatemalan security forces, through Guatemalan security forces. And when it comes to some of the border crisis, the immigration crisis we see today, one has to wonder, and one really has to look back at the 1954 coup, the continued support for destabilization and violence and the power vacuum that created, and the lack of a democratic government that has caused this refugee crisis. This has caused this asylum crisis, where all these people, if you look at some of the most popularly or the countries where people are, immigrate from on the border, where they're coming from. If you look at the U.S.-Mexico border, a lot of those people coming from Guatemala, coming from Honduras, other countries where the U.S. has interfered in over the years. It is a tale as old as time, and it is instability that we have created and fundamentally refused to address. Will we address it in the future? It remains to be seen. But one thing's for sure, this created the immigration crisis that we see today through this incredible amount of destabilization, through the violence. People have obviously been forced to flee, forced to beg for the very country that immiserated them, that destroyed any chance they had at any kind of independent democracy. They've been forced to beg to that country for support, beg to that country for countenance and to be let in. And that fact alone is one that I think any American who especially believes in some of the myths of American exceptionalism and the classic line of, oh, if we're the worst country, then why is everyone trying to bang down our doors to get in here? Well, a lot of times it was because we were the ones that screwed up their country beyond any hope of repair in the first place. And perhaps there is no better example of that than the 1954 coup we did in Guatemala and the decades of chaos and death and violence and destruction that we created thereafter. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. We will be back next week with another story that shaped our world today that you need to know about. It's been Hidden History. And I do thank you so much for listening. I just want to say quickly that I do kind of regret my words there with the, to say that Guatemalan society is quote unquote beyond repair is pretty ridiculous. It can obviously be a stronger democracy just like the United States can, and does have a lot of kind of structural damage and assault on this democracy due to actions that we have taken over the years, and could be a lot stronger of a democracy had that stuff not happened and ensure a much better life for its people. But that does not mean it is quote unquote beyond repair. That is definitely something I wanted to clarify before I release this show. But anyway, with that being said, we're back next week. It's Hidden History.